If someone says to you, "Oh no, I am a biological woman," how do you know that they're not?
Well, what we explain in the code.
I would argue that common sense isn't actually that common, and my interpretation of what might be common sense might be very different to somebody else's.
Now, yesterday we watched a video about the Women and Equalities Committee meeting on the 9th of June 2026, where they were scrutinising the work of the Equality and Human Rights Commission, where Labour MP Nadia Whittome brought up the discrimination of the trans community to the chair of the Equality and Human Rights Commission, Dr. Mary-Ann Stephenson. Well, Lib Dem's Christine Jardine asked a question that I had been thinking about for quite a long time myself.
Just the questions that we've just heard and the answers seem to me to point up the whole basis of the issue that people have perhaps expressed concern over, this common sense approach. And, how do you know if, on what grounds does someone look like a man or a woman, and when do you interject? Once you've done that, once you've said that my common sense tells me that this person is not a biological woman, how did they prove it? How did they then say, yes, I am a biological woman and I can use that facility if, as you say, there is no certificate, there is no paperwork that they can produce, when actually surely that was the whole point of the Gender Recognition Act and gender recognition certificates, so that we had a way of saying this person is entitled to use that facility.
Well,
how do we do it now?
I think. I mean, there's a few issues here. So first of all, I mean, one of the things that the Supreme Court pointed out was that making access to a service dependent on whether or not you had a certificate, which was confidential, was not a satisfactory way of resolving things. We do have an issue that we don't have any documentation that reliably proves sex. Nevertheless, we still manage to operate all sorts of single-sex services very effectively because the vast majority of people follow the rules. And we have single-sex toilets at the moment. We don't have to check the sex of people going into them. There are organisations that run single-sex violence against women services very effectively at the moment. I think that there is an issue that there is no legal documentation. I fully accept that, and that's recognised in the code. But that doesn't mean that these services aren't operable.
But my point was, if to use the terminology of the Supreme Court and the guidance, a biological woman is challenged going into a single-sex space for perhaps good reason on the part that, their common sense tells them that this may not be a biological woman. How do we prove that we are?
Well, in most circumstances where people are challenged, as soon as they open their mouth, say something, it's normally, from my experience, somebody catches a glimpse out of the corner of their eye and isn't sure and checks, and somebody says, oh, I am in the right place, I'm a woman, and that is fine. That's how things operate all the time right now.
If someone says to you, oh no, I am a biological woman, how do you know that they're not?
Well, what we explain in the code is that the decision you make has to depend on, the service that you're providing, the seriousness of it remaining single sex, what the evidence is, if there has been complaints, all of those sorts of things. But we have operated for decades with legislation that has allowed for single sex services, and we have managed to deliver those very effectively. From before the Gender Recognition Act, there's provision in the original Sex Discrimination Act allowing for single-sex services. We have been able to operate those effectively. And by and large, it's dependent on people following the rules. And then if they're not followed, on people taking kind of proportionate and sensible action and sensitive action, because we do talk in the code about how you ask and in ensuring sensitivity, for example.
You may have noticed the term common sense is doing a lot of heavy lifting here, isn't it? Well, so did fellow Lib Dem MP Alex Brewer.
I just want to follow up on this in a bit more detail because, and specifically on this point about common sense. If we go back a few hundred years, it was common sense that the earth was flat. And if we go back 200 years, it was common sense that women were far too emotional and sensitive to vote. So I would argue that common sense isn't actually that common, and my interpretation of what might be common sense might be very different to somebody else's. This is a code of practice, which is, as far as I understand it, and please correct me if I'm wrong, guidance on the practical implications of the law. And this new code of practice has come about because of a very high-profile court case. And so businesses and organisations and charities and so on will be concerned about litigation and how they can make practical implications to avoid very expensive litigation on their watch. So they will want to know exactly, not how, use a common sense approach. Well, what does that look like in practice? And that's what they're looking for. And my question is, the guidance talks about in a number of places comfort, people's comfort. So my question to you is, in situations where different groups' sense of comfort directly conflicts, how does the EHRC expect providers to weigh those competing claims in a consistent and lawful way to avoid litigation? And will the code be supplemented with a clearer decision-making framework to avoid inconsistent or discriminatory outcomes?
Okay, so there's a lot in there. I mean, on your first point on common sense, I mean, yes, I would agree. Maybe common sense is the wrong term. What I'm trying to express is that we have had single and separate sex services for decades, and we have not had problems with being able to decide who is and isn't allowed into them. And we recognise, I mean, the code can only tell people what they can do within the law, and we are in a situation where there is no legal documentation that you can ask for to prove somebody's sex. That's a fact. So we can't say check for this or check for that, because that doesn't exist. In terms of kind of additional guidance or making things clear for people, I mean, I think what the code does is set out very clearly what service providers should do in order to avoid, as you say, expensive and time-consuming litigation, and across all protected characteristics. And in all of them, there may be areas where it's not immediately apparent what somebody's protected characteristic is, and you might have to ask. There are invisible disabilities. You might not know if somebody's pregnant, age. Some of those things you can prove. Some of those things people might not have evidence on them on the day. We are certainly looking at areas where we think additional advice or guidance might be needed, for example, around charities where there's particular complexity in the law, and around particular types of services that might have to make difficult decisions, following on the code. Just one final point, which is that we didn't update this code because of the Supreme Court judgment. Work to update the code started significantly prior to the Supreme Court judgment, and we had actually submitted one version of the code to the Secretary of State before the Supreme Court judgment. We then had to revise it to take that into account.
Now, I totally agree with Alex Brewer when she talks about how people used to think it was common sense to say the earth is flat, and that it was common sense to say that women were too emotional to be allowed to vote. So when I hear the term common sense, I usually just roll my eyes and then just switch off, because the one thing I found when it comes to being sensible, it's not very common, is it? I also found what Christine Jardine had to say was very, very insightful as well, because I've been saying the same thing for quite a while now, because how are you going to implement something like this? It just seems incredibly unworkable to me, doesn't it? But anyway, what do you guys think? Let me know down below, and I shall bid you farewell and take care, my friends.